Days before her massive TV wedding, Julie McCullough was physically escorted off the set, her career destroyed in a ruthless moral purge. Her only crime, an old adult magazine photo shoot. Her executioner, the most ruthless teenage star in Hollywood history. When Kirk Cameron discovered her past, the moral tyrant refused to touch a sinner. He issued a cold-blooded ultimatum, forcing the network to fire an adult woman simply to appease his extremist ego. This is the agonizing trauma of how Kirk Cameron ruined Mike and Julie. But how exactly does a teenage boy acquire the unchecked corporate power to destroy an adult woman's livelihood? The origin of this disaster traces back to 1989. The ABC network had a highly profitable problem on their hands. Their family sitcom, Growing Pains, was a massive hit, but the core teenage audience was growing up. The network executives knew they needed a compelling new storyline to keep the viewers hooked. They needed a serious long-term romance for their main financial asset, Kirk Cameron. To achieve this, the network decided to hire an older, more grounded actress. They cast Julie McCullough to play the family nanny, Julie Costello. When Kirk and Julie first met on the soundstage, the power dynamic was completely unnatural and deeply unbalanced. Julie was a working-class actress trying to survive in an incredibly expensive and competitive industry. Landing a recurring role on a top-rated network television show was a massive financial lifeline. It meant steady paychecks, health insurance, and industry validation. She needed this job. She signed a standard Hollywood contract, which legally bound her to the production schedule. She expected to walk into a normal professional working environment. Instead, she walked into a kingdom completely ruled by a teenager. Kirk Cameron was not just the lead actor on the call sheet. He was the undisputed financial engine of the entire network. His face was on every magazine. He generated TNS of millions of dollars in highly lucrative advertising revenue. Because of this massive financial weight, the adult executives never told him no. The seasoned directors and the veteran producers quickly realized that their own livelihoods, their mortgages, and their corporate bonuses depended entirely on keeping Kirk happy. The system actively trained him to believe that he was untouchable. He dictated the rules on the set. When Julie stood next to him to rehearse their very first scenes together, she had to carefully navigate his massive ego. She was a professional adult, but she was acutely aware that she was completely expendable. She had to ensure she did not overshadow him because he held the unspoken power to have her removed from the script if he felt uncomfortable. Despite the awkward, unbalanced off-screen dynamic, the cameras captured something entirely different. The contrast between the two actors worked perfectly. Mike Seaver was the chaotic, rebellious bad boy. Julie Costello was the calm, mature, and patient nanny. The audience immediately responded to the chemistry. The ratings exploded. The ABC network executives looked at the viewership numbers and issued a clear corporate directive to the writing staff. Put Kirk and Julie together in every possible scene. This corporate order completely changed the daily reality for both actors. They were suddenly forced to spend 12 to 14 hours a day in close physical proximity. The scripts demanded that they act out a deep, developing romance. They had to hold hands, gaze into each other's eyes, and deliver highly emotional dialogue. For Julie, this was a highly stressful, calculated job. She had to project perfect love and affection toward a teenage boy who possessed absolute corporate power over her entire livelihood. She could not afford to make a mistake. She maintained strict, unwavering professionalism. She memorized her lines perfectly. hit her marks on the studio floor, and did exactly the directors instructed her to do. She genuinely believed that if she did a good job, her contract would protect her. She did not yet understand the cold reality of the Hollywood system. She did not know that a legal contract is completely worthless if the leading star decides he no longer likes you. Kirk, meanwhile, was operating in a highly dangerous psychological bubble. The television network had spent years coddling him, removing any natural consequences for his behavior. He viewed Julie not as an equal, hard-working colleague, but simply as a supporting character in his own life story. He enjoyed the massive ratings boost her character brought to his show, but he felt absolutely no professional loyalty to her as a human being. The system taught him that crew members and guest stars were replaceable props. As the 1989 television season progressed, the writers pushed the Mike and Julie storyline toward its logical, highly profitable conclusion. They wrote a massive engagement storyline. The audience was thrilled. The network began selling commercial time for the upcoming wedding episode at astronomical rates. The executives were preparing to collect tens of millions of dollars. The entire production was moving forward smoothly. Julie was preparing for the biggest episode of her career, feeling secure in her position. But behind the scenes, Kirk Cameron was undergoing a profound, radical personal shift. He was adopting a strict, uncompromising ideology that was about to turn the television set into a hostile courtroom, and his leading lady was about to become his primary target. The transition into the 1989 season marked a fundamental and dangerous shift in the atmosphere on the set. Kirk Cameron underwent a profound, highly publicized religious awakening. He became a devout, born-again Christian. In any normal sector of society, an individual's personal spiritual journey is their own private business. But a television set contour, owned by a teenage monopoly, is not a normal workplace. Kirk did not keep his newly adopted ideology private. He brought his strict, uncompromising religious framework directly onto the soundstage and began to weaponize it against his colleagues. He established a rigid moral censorship over the entire production. Because he held the absolute power to halt filming, he began demanding immediate, sweeping changes to the scripts. He refused to say lines that he felt promoted secular values. He demanded that any mildly suggestive jokes be completely removed. The network executives, completely terrified of upsetting their primary source of advertising revenue, instantly capitulated. They allowed a teenage actor to act as the supreme moral arbiter of a multi-million-dollar corporate asset. For Julie McCullough, this sudden shift created an incredibly suffocating and psychologically demanding workplace. She was hired to play the romantic lead in a lighthearted family comedy. Her job was to act out the joyful, carefree progression of a young relationship. But she was now forced to perform these scenes opposite a young man who was constantly policing her behavior and judging the morality of the script. The physical proximity required for their romantic scenes became deeply uncomfortable. When they had to hold hands or share a scripted kiss, Julie could feel the heavy judgmental tension radiating from him. She was a professional actress, trying to deliver a convincing performance while her scene partner was actively calculating whether the fake television intimacy was a sin against his personal faith. The dynamic completely inverted. She was an adult woman, yet she was forced to endure the sheer arrogance of a teenager who genuinely believed he operated on a higher moral plane than the rest of the working crew. The system had forced Julie into a highly vulnerable position. She had to swallow her pride and maintain her professionalism, focusing entirely on the upcoming wedding episode. She knew the marriage storyline was a massive ratings event, and she believed her position was secure because the network had already invested millions of dollars in promoting the on-screen wedding. She fundamentally underestimated how quickly the Hollywood machine will abandon a woman to protect a powerful man's ego. The fatal blow to Julie's career was not delivered by poor acting, declining ratings, or a breach of contract. It was triggered by a discovery in the late summer of 1989. Kirk Cameron, operating with the righteous indignation of a newly converted zealot, discovered a detail about Julie's personal history. 4 years earlier, in 1986, long before she was ever cast as the wholesome nanny on the family sitcom, Julie had worked as a model. She had posed as a centerfold for a highly popular, internationally circulated adult magazine. It is absolutely crucial to understand that this was not a secret. The casting directors, the high-ranking producers, and the executives at the ABC network were entirely aware of her modeling past when they hired her. They had run standard background checks. They simply did not care. In the cynical, profit-driven world of network television, an actress's past modeling jobs are entirely irrelevant as long as she tests well with the target demographic. They hired Julie because she was a talented professional who looked great on camera and possessed perfect comedic timing. She never lied to her employers, and she never breached her corporate contract. But Kirk Cameron did not know, and when he found out, his reaction was swift, absolute, and entirely uncompromising. He did not view her past through the lens of a working-class woman taking a legal, high-paying job in her early 20s to survive in a brutally competitive industry. He viewed it entirely through the narrow, rigid lens of his extreme religious ideology. He instantly labeled her a sinner. He decided that her history was a direct, personal affront to his own moral purity. The psychological whiplash for Julie was devastating. She arrived at the studio to do the job she had been performing perfectly for a year, only to find that the leading man was now looking at her with absolute, unconcealed disgust. The romantic dynamic on the set completely shattered. Kirk refused to interact with her outside of the rolling cameras. He treated her not as a fellow human being or a respected colleague, but as a moral contaminant that had infected his television show. The trauma of this specific form of workplace bullying is profound. Julie was not being judged on her work ethic, her acting ability, or her punctuality. She was being judged and condemned by a teenager for a legal job she had done years before she ever met him. Her dignity was entirely stripped away on the soundstage. She had to stand under the hot studio lights, fully aware that the man playing her loving fiancé actually despised her off camera. She had to continue smiling for the lenses, absorbing the heavy, silent hostility from the most powerful person in the room, completely unsupported by the adults who had hired her. Kirk Cameron's moral outrage quickly escalated from passive-aggressive disgust into a direct corporate threat. He could not separate the fictional reality of his character, Mike Seaver, from his own personal identity. He decided that allowing his television character to marry a woman who had posed in an adult magazine was completely unacceptable to his faith. He felt it would permanently compromise his soul and his carefully curated public image as a devout Christian. He did not care that the network had spent millions of dollars promoting the wedding. He did not care that the writing staff had spent an entire year meticulously crafting the storyline. And he certainly did not care that Julie McCullough relied on her contract to pay her rent and feed herself. He looked at the massive corporate machinery built around him and decided to use it as a weapon. He was preparing to walk into the executive boardrooms of the ABC network and deliver a ruthless ultimatum that would force the corporation to choose between their financial greed and a woman's career. The stage was set for one of the most cowardly corporate executions in television history. In the late summer of 1989, the situation reached a breaking point. While Cameron later claimed he only expressed discomfort with his co-star's past, multiple accounts suggest a direct corporate ultimatum. The network was forced to choose between an actress fulfilling her legally binding contract and their primary source of advertising revenue. Julie McCullough had not violated a single clause of her television contract. She had never been unprofessional on the soundstage. She had never missed a rehearsal, and she had consistently delivered high-quality comedic performances that drove the ratings of the program through the roof. Furthermore, her 1986 appearance in a popular adult magazine was not a hidden secret. It was a completely legal, highly publicized modeling job that occurred years before she was ever hired by the network. The casting directors, the producers, and the highest-ranking executives at ABC knew exactly who she was and what she had done before they offered her the role. They simply did not care because she was talented and the audiences loved her. But network television executives are not moral philosophers. They are accountants. When faced with Kirk Cameron's aggressive demand, they did not defend their employee. They did not sit their teenage star down and explain the basic principles of workplace fairness, religious tolerance, or professional boundaries. They did not tell him that an actor does not have the legal right to fire a colleague over a personal ideological disagreement. Instead, they retreated to their boardrooms and ran a cold, mathematical risk assessment. On one side of the E, Ledger was a talented supporting actress who possessed basic labor rights and a legally binding contract. On the other side of the ledger was a teenage boy who generated hundreds of millions of dollars in syndication deals, merchandise sales, and primetime advertising rates. The executives looked at the numbers and made a completely bloodless decision. They chose the money. They chose to protect the multi-million-dollar asset, completely abandoning their legal and moral obligation to protect an innocent employee from blatant, ideology-driven discrimination. The execution of this corporate decision was swift, brutal, and completely devoid of any basic human respect. There was no formal trial. There was no opportunity for Julie to defend her career, her character, or her professionalism. The network executives did not call a respectful meeting to negotiate an amicable exit. They simply dropped the axe. Just days before the cameras were scheduled to roll on the massive, highly promoted wedding episode, the ABC network summarily fired Julie McCullough. Imagine the absolute psychological devastation of that exact moment for a working actress. Julie had spent an entire year meticulously building the character of the beloved family nanny. She had endured the hostile, judgmental environment created by Kirk. She was actively preparing for the most important episode of her career, likely attending wardrobe fittings for her television wedding dress and memorizing her final lines. In a single phone call, the entire foundation of her life was completely ripped away. She was physically escorted out of the television machine without a single valid professional justification. This firing was not just the loss of a steady paycheck. It was the deliberate destruction of a career. In the highly competitive ecosystem of 1990s Hollywood, being abruptly fired from the biggest family comedy on television carried a massive, unspoken stigma. The industry is small, and rumors spread rapidly. Casting directors at other networks would look at her sudden disappearance from Growing Pains and naturally assume that she must have done something terribly wrong to be let go right before a wedding episode. Kirk Cameron did not just use his power to get her off his specific soundstage. By forcing the network to fire her so abruptly, he effectively branded her as a problem, severely damaging her future earning potential and her professional reputation. He weaponized his corporate monopoly to crush a woman's livelihood, and the system happily handed him the weapon. But firing the actress solved only half of the network's problem. The corporate executives had successfully appeased their radicalized teenage star, but they had created a massive, immediate narrative disaster. The ABC marketing department had spent the entire summer heavily promoting the upcoming wedding between Mike Seaver and Julie Costello. They had sold premium commercial time to advertisers based on the guarantee of a massive television event. Millions of viewers across America were eagerly waiting to watch the beloved couple exchange their vows. The network now had a highly promoted wedding episode with no bride and a leading man who refused to compromise. The writers were thrown into an absolute panic. They were given a near impossible deadline. They had to completely rewrite the entire storyline overnight. They had to fabricate a reason for the sudden permanent disappearance of a central character, and they had to do it in a way that protected the golden boy image of their leading man. They were ordered to craft a lie so convincing and so emotionally manipulative that the viewing public would never suspect the ugly, ruthless corporate execution that had just taken place behind the studio doors. The writing staff sat down with empty pages, preparing to execute one of the most successful psychological manipulations in broadcasting history. The frantic writing sessions that took place in the ABC offices in the late summer of 1990 represent one of the most calculated acts of psychological manipulation in television history. The writers were handed a corporate mandate that was fundamentally unfair, but entirely non-negotiable. They had to explain why the highly promoted television wedding was suddenly canceled, and they had to do it without ever exposing the dark, discriminatory reality of Kirk Cameron's ultimatum. They needed a scapegoat. Because Julie McCullough had been physically barred from the studio lot, she could not defend her character. She could not advocate for a respectful exit. Her television identity was entirely at the mercy of the corporate machine that had just fired her. The writers crafted a storyline that was designed to completely assassinate the character of Julie Costello, thereby protecting the golden boy image of their leading man. When the first episode of the 6th season finally aired, millions of viewers tuned in, completely unaware of the ruthless corporate execution that had taken place behind closed doors. They sat in their living rooms, expecting to watch the beautiful culmination of a year-long romance. Instead, they were fed a carefully constructed lie. The episode depicted the day of the wedding. The sets were decorated, the guests were seated, and Mike Seaver stood at the altar, waiting for his bride. But Julie never walked down the aisle. The script dictated that she simply abandoned him. She left him standing there, completely humiliated and heartbroken, right before they were supposed to exchange their vows. The network aired scenes of the teenage heartthrob looking completely devastated. His dreams of a happy marriage violently crushed by a woman who had supposedly changed her mind at the very last second. The audience reaction was exactly what the ABC executives had calculated. Millions of viewers across the country wept. They felt a profound, overwhelming sympathy for Mike Seaver. They watched heed the tears in his eyes and felt genuine heartbreak for his suffering. Consequently, the viewing public directed a massive wave of anger and resentment toward the character of Julie. They viewed her as a cruel, selfish woman who had broken the heart of America's favorite teenager. This is where the sheer, unvarnished cruelty of the Hollywood machine becomes undeniable. The television network successfully used a fictional script to completely invert reality. On the television screen, Mike Seaver was the tragic victim, and Julie Costello was the heartless villain. In reality, the exact opposite was true. Julie McCullough was a hardworking professional who had just been brutally stripped of her livelihood and her career without a shred of due process. Kirk Cameron was the ruthless architect of her destruction. Imagine the psychological trauma of being Julie McCullough on the night that specific episode aired. She was sitting in her home, unemployed, her career severely damaged by a sudden, unexplained firing. She had to watch the television network broadcast a highly emotional lie to millions of people. She watched the teenage boy who had successfully demanded her termination stand in front of the cameras and pretend to be devastated by her absence. She watched him weaponize his acting skills to harvest the sympathy of the nation, knowing full well that he had cold-bloodedly orchestrated the entire tragedy in a corporate boardroom just weeks prior. Kirk Cameron's performance in that episode is a chilling display of corporate power disguised as art. He stood at the altar and acted out the pain of abandonment while operating with the absolute secure knowledge that he had successfully purged his workplace of a woman he deemed morally inferior. He used his strict, uncompromising religious ideology to justify the destruction of a colleague's career, and then he used the television cameras to frame himself as the victim. The ABC network actively aided and abetted this deception. They used the genuine, heartfelt emotions of their audience as a shield to hide a blatant act of workplace discrimination. They completely ruined the Mike and Julie romance, not for artistic reasons, but because a radicalized teenager demanded a corporate cleansing. But the ruthless execution of the leading lady did not magically fix the atmosphere on the soundstage. In fact, Kirk Cameron's victory in the boardroom created a permanent, suffocating chill on the set of Growing Pains. He had successfully forced the network to bend entirely to his will, but in doing so, he completely destroyed the professional trust of everyone around him. The other cast members, including the veteran actors who played his parents, were acutely aware of what had actually happened. They knew exactly why Julie had disappeared. They had watched her show up to work every day, hit her marks, and act with absolute professionalism. They knew her 1986 modeling job had absolutely no bearing on her ability to perform her current role. When they saw the network instantly cave to Kirk's extremist demands and fire an innocent woman, they realized exactly how vulnerable they all were. They understood that the teenage boy standing next to them possessed the absolute power to destroy any of their careers on a mere whim, simply by threatening to walk away from the show. As the production moved into its final seasons, the set transformed into a hostile, icy workplace. The warm family dynamic that was broadcast to the public was entirely dead behind the cameras. The cast members still showed up for work. They stood on their designated marks. They delivered their comedic lines perfectly. They smiled and acted like a loving family for the lenses. But the exact second the director yelled "cut," the illusion instantly evaporated. There was no friendly banter between takes. There was no collaborative energy. The other actors began to completely isolate Kirk Cameron. They distanced he themselves from him, disgusted by the ruthless way he had treated a fellow professional, and terrified of becoming his next target. The television set became a cold mechanical factory. They were simply fulfilling the terms of their legal contracts, counting down the days until the syndication requirements were met so they could finally escape the toxic environment. Kirk had won his ideological battle. He had successfully purged his television environment of anything that offended his personal extreme beliefs. But in the process of acting as the supreme moral judge, he completely isolated himself. He was the undisputed king of a multi-billion-dollar television franchise. But he was surrounded entirely by colleagues who silently despised the ruthless way he wielded his power. The ABC network executives did not care about the freezing temperatures on the soundstage. They did not care that the actors were miserable. They only cared that the cameras kept rolling and the advertising checks kept clearing. They maintained this highly uncomfortable, deeply fake environment for several more years, perfectly content to squeeze every last drop of financial value out of the property before the show officially closed its doors. The corporation proved that they were perfectly willing to let a religious fanatic crush a woman's career and poison an entire workplace, so long as the ratings remained high enough to satisfy the shareholders. The execution of the Mike and Julie romance did not just ruin a single storyline, it permanently broke the structural foundation of the entire television program. By the time Growing Pains entered its final seasons in 1991 and 1992, the vibrant, energetic family comedy that had captivated America was entirely dead. What remained on the screen was a highly profitable mechanical corpse. The ABC network had successfully protected their teenage monopoly by firing Julie McCullough, but they could not force the audience or the remaining cast members to forget the ruthless way it happened. The ghost of Julie Costello haunted every single episode they filmed after her sudden departure. The network executives quickly realized that firing the female lead had created a massive, glaring void in their most lucrative storyline. Mike Seaver was supposed to be the romantic anchor of the show. His progression from a rebellious teenager to a committed young man was the primary hook for millions of viewers. So the producers desperately tried to replace Julie. They brought in new actresses, wrote brand new romantic subplots, and tried to artificially recreate the magic. But the viewing public, completely unaware of the behind-the-scenes cruelty, but highly sensitive to on-screen chemistry, flatly rejected these new storylines. The audience felt cheated. The organic, natural spark that Kirk and Julie had shared could not be manufactured in a corporate boardroom. By using his absolute power to destroy his leading lady, Kirk Cameron had inadvertently destroyed the very storyline that made him a megastar. He had completely ruined Mike and Julie, and in doing so, he severely damaged his own television vehicle. Behind the cameras, the reality was even darker. The soundstage, once a place of genuine creative collaboration and loud laughter, had frozen into a state of permanent, hostile silence. The veteran actors on the show, particularly Alan Thicke, who played the father of the family, were deeply professional, but they were also fundamentally decent people. They had watched a young, hard-working actress get completely crushed by a radicalized teenager and a cowardly television network. They could not forgive it. They did not shout or cause massive scenes on the studio floor because they were bound by their own ironclad television contracts. They needed to finish the required episodes just as much as the network did to secure their own financial futures. But they instituted a brutal, unspoken, and a absolute freeze-out of their leading man. When the director called action, the cast would instantly snap into character. They would smile, deliver their punchlines flawlessly, and project the warm, comforting illusion of the perfect American family. The absolute second the director yelled "cut," the smiles vanished. The actors would immediately walk away from Kirk. They retreated to their private dressing rooms. There were no shared lunches. There was no friendly banter between scenes. There was no professional advice passed down from the veteran actors to the young star. Kirk Cameron, the boy who had demanded absolute moral purity and total control over his environment, found himself completely alone in the center of an empire he had poisoned. He had used his extreme religious ideology to build a massive wall around himself, actively protecting himself from anyone he deemed a sinner. But that wall quickly became a highly isolated, suffocating prison. He was the most powerful teenager in the television industry, yet nobody on his own set wanted to speak to him. He had to show up every single morning, stand under the hot studio lights, and perform light-hearted comedy in a room filled with adults who silently despised the ruthless way he wielded his corporate power. The ABC network forced everyone to endure this highly toxic atmosphere for 2 more years. The corporate executives did not care about the psychological misery of their cast. They did not care that the workplace had become a cold, unfeeling factory. They only cared about the syndication mathematics. They needed to cross the threshold of episodes required to sell the show into permanent reruns. As long as the weekly episodes were delivered on time, allowing them to squeeze every last drop of advertising revenue out of the dying franchise, they were perfectly content to let the actors suffer in silence. This specific era of the show perfectly encapsulates the cold, unfeeling nature of the Hollywood system. A television network is never a family. It is a highly funded assembly line. When the factory floor becomes toxic, when a powerful star begins to abuse his colleagues, the executives do not clean it up. They simply turn a blind eye and force the workers to keep producing the product until the machinery completely breaks down. The system had handed absolute unchecked power to a teenager who was completely unequipped to handle it with basic human decency. They allowed his fanaticism to ruin a woman's career, and then they locked him in a room with the people who hated him for it, demanding that they all smile and sell advertising time to the American public. The tragic romance of Mike and Julie was no longer just a canceled television storyline. It had become a daily grim reminder of exactly who was actually in charge. Every time Kirk Cameron had to perform a scene with a new temporary love interest, the entire crew remembered the woman who should have been standing there. The silence on the set grew heavier with every passing week, pushing the entire production toward an inevitable, hollow conclusion. The cameras finally stopped rolling on the set of the family sitcom in the spring of 1992. The ABC network had successfully achieved its ultimate corporate objective. They had crossed the necessary threshold of episodes required to unlock the massive billion-dollar syndication packages. They had squeezed every last drop of advertising revenue out of Kirk Cameron's fading teenage popularity. The exact second the final scene was filmed, the network executives abruptly pulled the plug. The show was canceled, the soundstage was shut down, and the deeply fractured cast was finally released from their legal contracts. The ending of the television program brought no sense of artistic triumph or warm nostalgia for the people who actually worked on the floor. There was only a profound, heavy sense of relief. The veteran actors packed up their dressing robes, OMs, and immediately scattered, desperate to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the teenage star who who had turned their workplace into a highly toxic, judgmental dictatorship. Kirk Cameron walked away from the studio lot, an incredibly wealthy young man, but he walked away entirely alone, having completely alienated the very people who had helped him build his empire. However, the true lasting tragedy of this specific Hollywood story did not happen to the people who stayed until the final episode. The lasting devastation belonged entirely to the woman who had been ruthlessly purged from the machine 2 years earlier. For Julie McCullough, the cancellation of the show in 1992 did not bring closure. It simply cemented the permanent, severe damage that Kirk Cameron and the ABC network had inflicted upon her life and her career. When you are brutally fired from the highest-rated comedy on television without any valid professional justification, the trauma does not simply vanish when you walk out the studio gates. Julie was forced to carry the heavy, silent stigma of that corporate execution for the rest of her professional life. Hollywood in the early 1990s was a tightly knit, highly cynical industry. Casting directors and producers at other networks looked at her sudden, highly publicized exit from the show and naturally made terrible assumptions. Because the ABC network had completely protected Kirk and hidden his religious ultimatum from the press, the industry assumed that Julie must have been the problem. They assumed she was difficult to work with, or unreliable, or unprofessional. The network allowed a false, damaging narrative to quietly destroy her reputation simply to protect their golden boy. Julie had to start completely over from the bottom. She had to go back to auditioning for minor guest starring roles, fighting to prove her professionalism all over again. She had been on the verge of massive mainstream star, Dom. She had been the female lead in a storyline that was watched by tens of millions of people. She had earned her place at the top through hard work, comedic timing, and perfect professional conduct. And all of it was completely wiped out in a single afternoon because a radicalized teenager discovered a completely legal modeling job she had done years before she ever met him. The psychological weight of this injustice was immense. Julie had to watch from the sidelines as the show transitioned into global syndication. This is where the absolute hypocrisy of the Hollywood system becomes stomach-turning. When the ABC network packaged the sitcom for reruns, they did not bury the episodes featuring Julie. In fact, they heavily featured them. The network executives knew exactly what the audience wanted. They knew that the Mike and Julie romance was the absolute peak of the show's popularity. So they broadcast those specific episodes constantly, every single day, across America and the world. Television networks replayed the scenes where Mike and Julie fell in love. They replayed the scenes where they held hands and planned their wedding. The ABC network continued to make millions of dollars by broadcasting the face and the talent of the exact same woman they had ruthlessly fired for being morally impure. Even worse, Kirk Cameron continued to collect massive residual checks from those exact same episodes. He had declared that acting opposite Julie was a violation of his strict religious faith. He had demanded her termination to protect his own moral purity. Yet he had absolutely no problem cashing the syndication checks generated by her hard work and her immense popularity with the audience. He used his fanaticism to completely destroy her career, but he was perfectly happy to profit off her image for the next 30 years. Julie was forced to endure the bizarre, highly traumatic experience of watching her younger self on television, playing out a beautiful romance with the man who had cold-bloodedly ruined her life behind the scenes. She received only a tiny fraction of the syndication money, while the teenager who had orchestrated her firing became a multimillionaire. The system did not just steal her job, it actively monetized her humiliation. The sitcom Growing Pains remains a staple of classic television syndication. It is still broadcast as a heartwarming, safe piece of family entertainment. But the history of the program leaves behind a very dark, permanent stain on the legacy of American television production. The story of Mike and Julie is not a romantic tragedy. It is a chilling forensic case study in how power operates when it is entirely unchecked by human decency. The audience in the 1990s was completely manipulated. They believed that television was a meritocracy, where good actors were rewarded and beautiful stories were allowed to naturally conclude. They did not understand that the images on their screen were tightly controlled by a ruthless corporate hierarchy that valued advertising dollars far above the basic labor rights of a working woman. The legacy of this cover-up forces us to confront the dangerous reality of the child star system. When a massive broadcasting corporation hands absolute dictatorial power to a teenager, they are building a highly volatile weapon. Kirk Cameron was allowed to operate under the delusion that his personal religious beliefs superseded the legal contracts, the professional boundaries, and the basic human dignity of his colleagues. He was allowed to act as the supreme judge and jury over a woman's entire career, simply because his face was capable of selling commercial airtime. The ABC network executives were not religious fanatics, but they were corporate cowards. They had the power to stand up to an arrogant star. They had the legal authority to protect a vulnerable employee from blatant discrimination. Instead, they took the path of least financial resistance. They tore up the script, fired the victim, and manufactured a massive lie to protect their profit margins. As we look back at the shows that defined our youth, we must strip away the nostalgia. The television industry wants us to remember the laughter and the tears, but we must look closer at the deep structural cruelty that produced them. The character of Mike Seaver was a lovable, harmless rogue. The reality of Kirk Cameron was that of a ruthless, highly empowered executive who used his religious ideology as a weapon to crush a fellow worker. Julie McCullough survived the Hollywood machine, but her abrupt exit remains a powerful, deeply uncomfortable warning. It reminds us that whenever absolute power intersects with extreme fanaticism, the system will always grind the most vulnerable people into dust to ensure the show goes on. Thank you for joining me on this complete investigation into the hidden history of television. If you value documentaries that break down the corporate illusions of the entertainment industry and expose the unvarnished reality behind the screen, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are many more locked files and buried secrets waiting to be opened. Until next time, remember that the most devastating tragedies in Hollywood are never written in the scripts. They are executed in silence behind the heavy soundproof doors of the studio lot.